Welcome to this IFPMA media briefing on COVID-19. Today we'll focus on vaccines and treatments. My name is Claire Dool. Journalists from now on, that's 2 p.m. Central European Time, 8 a.m. Eastern Time, you can start submitting your questions in the chat box. Do include your name and who you're working for. We'll be answering those questions during the second part of this briefing, once our speakers have set the scene. We have a truly global lineup of CEOs from some of the leading innovative biopharmaceutical companies. We have with us today Dr. Albert Bourla, Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of Pfizer, David Ricks, Chairman and Chief Executive Officer, Eli Lilly and Company, and Bill Anderson, Chief Executive Officer, Roche Pharmaceuticals. And in the studio with me here in Geneva is Thomas Cueni, Director General of the IFPMA. The IFPMA represents the pharmaceutical industry at the UN and at WHO. So, Thomas, your thoughts on the challenges that lay ahead?
Thank you, Claire, and thank you again for joining us for this media briefing that will give you a snapshot of what biopharmaceutical companies continue to innovate and manufacture in response to the pandemic. Already last year, we were telling policymakers that supplies of COVID-19 vaccines were fast outstripping demand. We ended 2021 with over 11 billion vaccines being manufactured. That's from 0 to 11 billion doses within a bit more than a year, which is a colossal scale-up involving hundreds of suppliers and partner manufacturers. Q1 22 has seen 13.7 billion doses delivered and 11 billion doses administered. Now orders are slowing down. Countries as well as organizations such as Africa CDC are not only asking for orders to be delayed, but are cancelling them. I find it difficult to square this picture with that which I heard presented on the international stage in the past weeks. Leading voices are still calling out vaccine scarcity. I do understand the concern. Vaccines are not reaching all those who need them. But the cause is no longer the lack of supplies. It's scarcity of vaccination, not vaccine, which is due to the lack of country readiness, absorption capacity, and the lack of resources needed to get the vaccines into arms. We, industry, predicted this trend, and we repeat our calls that you have heard us share since May last year that urgent steps are needed to get the vaccines to those who need them. No one is safe until everyone is safe. And this applies not only to this pandemic, but also to any discussion for future pandemic preparedness. We have seen heroic work of healthcare workers. We have seen the hugely important work done by the world's healthcare regulators during the pandemic, which saved millions of lives. Regulatory flexibility and collaboration among the leading agencies proved invaluable, in particular for vaccines. From fast-tracked approvals, e-signature authorizations to expedited scientific guidance and rolling review processes. We have seen the strength of a robust innovation ecosystem, expand partnerships, knowledge sharing and technology transfer in unprecedented ways. And we have seen the importance of partnerships, public-private as well as private-private, throughout the fight against the pandemic. But we have also seen vaccine nationalism, vaccine hoarding, and export bans. And we saw a lack of initial funding for initiatives such as COVAX needed to procure enough vaccines early to ensure equitable access. I understand the anger of many Africans who received the first vaccines in March 2021, but then cruelly saw the rest of the world jab their way through 2021 while they were left to wonder when the next vaccines would arrive. They did arrive later in 2021, but the harm had been done. We do need to and are starting to answer Africa's calls for more self-reliance. Vaccine nationalism and its manifestation through export bans some vaccine projects failing while others were successful, and late funding of COVAX robbed us of the promise of vaccine equity. These were the causes of vaccine inequity last year, and not, as many would wish you to believe, something that can be solved with a waiver on intellectual property and COVID-19 products. Let me be as outspoken as I have always been on this point. Equity needs to be our collective focus today and for future pandemics. But I'm stunned that the proposed IP waiver is still debated, while supplies are far outstripping demand, and some factories have been put to a halt because of missing orders. Actually, IP has never been a hindrance to scaling up vaccine manufacturing, but has been an enabler of hundreds of technology transfer and other forms of voluntary licensing. Omicron and other variants are a reminder of the importance of continued vaccination, but also COVID-19 treatments and testing. They underscore painfully the importance of full course immunization for the elderly, those with chronic diseases, and immunocompromised where they live. Global targets are meaningless in this context. To meet meaningful targets and use the stocks available, we need to tackle together distribution, absorption capacity, and vaccine hesitancy.
Thank you very, very much, Thomas. And indeed, as you say, supply is outstripping demand. We have the vaccines. It's about getting the vaccinations into people's arms, the last mile. And let's hear from our CEOs about how they've been responding. Let me begin with Dave Ricks of Eli Lilly. Dave, what has been your company's response? What have been the positives? And what have been the frustrations?
Great. Well, thanks for the question. Like other companies, including those on this briefing, we at Lilly felt a strong responsibility as the pandemic began to do what we could to help. We focused on areas where we thought we could be most helpful, which are things we had built up capability in for some time. And that ended up being really two prongs. One is to look at medicines we already made to see if they could be useful against the condition. And in particular, we focused on an anti-inflammatory medicine that interestingly was identified by a British group that focuses on screening using AI platforms for effectiveness, and very early in the pandemic identified baricitinib or Olumiant, which is a rheumatoid arthritis medicine, as possibly helpful in the later stages of the condition. We, within a week, set up a global phase 2 studies and phase 3, and then have produced a set of data that has now landed that drug on the WHO and many other countries' standard of care for patients who are ventilated with COVID-19, with a reduction in mortality that's quite significant. We also then worked on monoclonal antibodies, so producing new medicines that could arrest the virus before we knew we could have a vaccine. And this was a sprint and an all-out effort with a partner, a biotech company called Epsilera. And then later we partnered with Amgen and Samsung and others to produce at enormous scale in a really unprecedented period of time, monoclonal antibodies to relieve those before we had effective vaccination, and now even in high-risk patients after that period. I think we learned a lot through this, and the positives were really the collaboration and shared sense of purpose. Many conversations, including with companies here, about how to make this ramp up and really make a difference early. And within 8 months of starting the project, we had a medicine on the market. Lilly, I think, was the first approved medicine for COVID that was made from scratch at the beginning of the pandemic, our first series of monoclonal antibodies. We subsequently started another project for potentially resistant strains, and now that's the standard of care in the US, bebtelovimab. But I think there were frustrations, as you're pointing out, despite the collaboration, both across private sector and with public actors. The world, as it relates to drug development, is hugely fragmented as a baseline. And I think that was actually a little bit worse during the pandemic than normal. Different regulators had different standards. There wasn't even agreement on what the background standard of care should be. And so when conducting a global clinical trial, which everyone would like us to do in this setting, and you have to do it very rapidly because there's surging cases, you need cases to measure an effect with medicines. It was very complicated to decide what we would compare a new medicine to. I think there's really a need to have a much better way to define a standard of care and align global regulators in this context. And I think that was an enormous problem. The other big problem is one I'm sure we'll touch on, which is that of distribution and funding for breakthrough therapies. And here, I think the US has a unique mechanism that I know the European Union is looking at and others, but what about less developed countries to do advanced procurement? Because the velocity of these projects is so fast. You really need to partner at the very beginning with governments on the end sale in order to product goes to the right place at the right time. And unlike other medicines, in particular, the antibodies have a shelf life of 6 months maximum, it turned out, due to variant development with the disease. And in some cases, the procurement cycles with foreign governments is much longer than that. So it became a kind of this chasing process. And I think we missed the opportunity to save more lives because of that. So I think those are the two main for getting our medicines to the right patients.
And there were trade barriers, of course, too, that didn't help with export.
Well, right. And I'll touch on that maybe as it relates to the IP discussion we're having now. But of course, we had this ludicrous situation where countries were calling for us to make sure our medicines got to other nations and their citizens, and at the same time, legally constraining our ability to do so. And so that's a huge problem. And I really think, especially amongst developed countries where we do our production, primarily Europe and US, we need a way to not have us first look out for ourselves, but actually take on the global responsibility and look out for everyone. And that may mean stratifying risk in our home countries in a way that creates political challenges, but on the other hand, could help save more lives globally. And that was not the behavior, particularly in 2020 and early 21, of developed economies, starting with the United States, which I think had really quite a strict interpretation of this export controls.
Dave, you mentioned, of course, the IP waiver, lots of discussions going on there, of course, also with the World Trade Organization based here in Geneva. What's your view on those discussions?
Not very positive. Maybe I can go first. I'm sure Albert might have a few things to say about this topic as well. But first of all, as a practical matter, well, the goal may be shared between industry and the critics who are driving this discussion, which is to ensure that our medicines and vaccines reach everyone in the world in an equitable and fair way. We share that goal. But it's not at all clear to us how changing the IP rules does anything to achieve that goal. And in fact, it may be undermining that goal, would be our point. And just to step back from that, I think as a practical matter, there is not a constraint on either medicines or vaccine supply at this point. I believe it's true that we're producing globally more than 1 billion vaccines a month as a sector, and there's plenty of medication capacity as well. So as a practical matter, it's not a supply problem. It's not a demand problem. It's a matching of supply and demand problem. IP will do nothing. IP waiver will do nothing to change that equation. I think there are other practical matters that are important to focus on. There's been a call to build capacities in developing countries so they can respond to this pandemic, presumably. But I think we're completely ignoring the fact that under global regulatory standards, to produce a new parenteral facility is probably a 3 to 4 year time horizon. And I think, imagining that the answer will come in 2026 is really, I think hard to see how that's at all helpful here. And then there's, I think, really important strategic considerations here. It's important to note that all of the vaccines and medicines we're talking about didn't start from nothing in January of 2020. They built upon, in some cases, decades-long investments in underlying technologies that were rapidly repurposed to solve the COVID problem. Those investments would never have been made if there was not the promise of IP. And the next investments on the unknown technology, which we can repurpose for the next pandemic, won't be made if investors today believe at the end of the day, IP will be undermined for no good reason, because as I said, we don't have practical constraints. So that's a huge problem with this proposal. The second problem is the behavior that it will induce in addition to the investor behavior. What is a patent? It's a promise to disclose our inventions in return for a period of exclusivity. And I think you'll get much less disclosure about inventions, actually, as a result of an IP waiver, which again allows, after a period of reward, for other companies to step in and a robust generic market, for instance. That will not exist. If there's an IP waiver, there'll be a strong incentive to retain know-how, retain the recipes for what we do, much like you see in some other industries, not in the pharma industry. And I think that's counterproductive for human health in the long term. So this is a proposal that is a solution looking for a problem. It's not going to change the supply equation at all. And I think it has serious impacts on the long-term ability to respond to pandemics, both because of the lack of investment in underlying technologies that will occur and what companies' natural reaction will be, which is to share less information.
Thanks, Dave. Yes, solution looking for a problem. Albert, do you want to pick up on what Dave has just been said about the IP waiver?
Actually, Dave said it so well that I don't think I can really add into this question.
It was a comprehensive answer. I think we could definitely say that.
What else to add. What I can tell it is that just provide some facts to understand what we are talking about. Right now, we, through the US government, have offered 1 billion doses that they are there and sitting, right? Those, from those 1 billion doses, 200 have been given. 800 million doses right now are offered by the US government to the poorest countries of the world completely free. Not at cost, completely free. And they cannot give them. Because the problem is not if there is availability or access through pricing. The problem is that the infrastructure in a lot of these countries is very poor, so they cannot absorb. They cannot run a vaccination campaign. There is a very big part which is related with people's hesitancy. So people, they don't want to do the vaccine to way larger percentages than in the developed world. But also, there is a lot of difficulty in the US or in Europe. Getting a vaccine might mean a trip of 15, 20 minutes to a vaccination center. Over there might mean that you need to walk 8 hours until you come to a vaccination center. So there is a lot of need for infrastructure. Coming back to your question,
yes.
Coming back to your original question, what I regret I was not able to convince people that instead of the first months trying to making the focal and only point that vaccines needs to go to Africa as well, they should have start preparing the ground, us included, so that when the vaccines availability was there, they could really absorb it. This is what everyone now needs to do. This is what WHO, this is what UNICEF, this is what us, we should all work together to make sure that we improve the infrastructure in poorest countries of the world so that they can absorb vaccines that are coming to them free, and as a result, being able to protect not only them, but all of us.
Thank you, Albert. I mean, perhaps you would want to say a few words about what you have been doing to scale up on vaccines. Of course, there's a lot of interest in your antiviral pill, Paxlovid, but also your treatments.
Look, I mean, let me start with one thing that might not be that known. The first concern that we had as Pfizer was to maintain the supply of injectable, sterile injectables in hospital chain. During 2020, the big problem of society was that the hospitals were overwhelmed. the demand for these products jumped 80, 90 times sometimes. And we had to operate under pandemic conditions, so people couldn't go in and out of the manufacturing sites in a very easy manner. I think it's not, this story is relatively unknown, but I think we were able to achieve a small miracle with our manufacturing sites being able to deliver all the medicines that are needed around the world. You remember a lot of outcries at that time. We were lacking everything. We were lacking masks. We were lacking respirators because of this surge. It was way less the concerns about lacking medicines, because really we were stepped up and to increase manufacturing. That was the first thing. Of course, the other two things are well known. We stepped up to develop a COVID vaccine, and we all know the Pfizer BioNTech vaccine that came to humanity as the first one in December of 2020. In UK was the first individual who received it in the world, a vaccine against COVID. And then, of course, a year later, we came with a new oral treatment that was able to stop people that were sick, prevented at 90% hospitalizations and deaths. So significant advancements. All of us not only were able to invent and develop, but also we were able to manufacture. To give you a magnitude of the scale that we were able to do, during 2019, the year before pandemic, during 2020, let's say, we, as Pfizer, were producing 200 million doses of vaccines globally. 200 million of vaccines, of all our vaccines, across all our manufacturing sites in the world. In 2021, we produced 3 billion, not from 200 millions, 300 millions, produced from 200 million, 3 billion of vaccine that was never produced before. And we did that with zero quality problems. Virtually, I can't recall a single batch that we had to recall, or a single vial that we had to recall. I can't recall. Maybe there was one, but I don't. So I think that was a tremendous success of our manufacturing, in addition to our clinical development machine. And then, of course, with the treatments, the same. Something that was never manufactured before. Right now, already in the first quarter, we released 6 million treatments to the world, and we are moving to release by the end of June 30, and we are very, very confident that we will achieve our target.
Thank you. Bill, bringing you in on treatments, a few words about Roche's journey in developing treatments for patients with COVID-19.
Yeah, thanks. I really didn't expect that as an industry we would be able to react so quickly to the pandemic. But I think it's really shown the power of innovation and the commitment of the industry, as well as how far we can work how far we can move when we work together with all kinds of stakeholders. And I would say, from the perspective of Roche, I'm proud that we were one of very few companies to bring not one, but 2 medicines to patients. We were also the first company to bring a high volume automated PCR test to the market. And we've delivered another 20 testing solutions since that time. We've enabled over 1.3 billion COVID tests. But we basically decided early on that we would do whatever it took to fight the pandemic. And as Dave said, we also said, let's figure out what are we strong at, and we're going to focus there. Hence, we ended up in testing and medications, because we didn't have any experience with vaccines. We took a lot of risks. For example, we initiated a global phase 3 trial program for Actemra just 3 weeks after the WHO declared the global pandemic in March of 2020. And in parallel, and without even knowing whether it would work, we started to ramp up our own manufacturing capacity and to seek out manufacturing partners. Speaking of partnering, we did a lot of that. For example, with Regeneron, we partnered on COVID antibody cocktails, like Ronapreve is the product. And while we didn't know whether the clinical studies would be successful, we completed the technology transfer for the manufacturing in record time. It took us about 3 months instead of 9 months. And of course, this is when the world was shut down. So, we did a number of these sorts of things. And I think we learned what could be done. And I think, as Dave and Albert mentioned, industry was ready, in part because we have the capabilities and we have the people, but also because we've made these investments over many years. So, for example, Albert and the Pfizer team have worked with BioNTech to bring an amazing vaccine that I've been the beneficiary of, and many of you on this call have been the beneficiary of. But most people don't realize, that technology has been funded for many years by innovators. So, for example, Roche has a partnership with BioNTech developing the same technology for cancer vaccines. And it's investments like that over many, many years that allowed this miraculous COVID vaccine to be prepared in record time. And things like IP waivers are totally toxic to that whole system that has allowed us to fight through this pandemic.
Bill, what about improving access to treatments? What have you been doing there, especially to the low and middle income countries?
Yeah, I think this is another area where the companies have demonstrated their commitment by actions. Well, there's been a lot of unproductive chatter and talk from other parties outside of the industry about, notions of trying to help other countries while the companies have been doing it. So, for example, we saw this early on. We said, hey, it just can't be that these breakthroughs that we're trying to achieve are just for rich countries. It needs to be for everyone. And so we, voluntarily decided right up front, hey, we're going to dedicate a portion of our manufacturing to low and middle income countries. As an example, when the Delta wave hit in Q2 of last year, and a lot of people say Q2, oh, I thought that was Q3. No, actually in India and in Africa, it was Q2. And our number one destination for our product Actemra in that quarter was India. And this was a medicine that was shown in hospitals to basically keep people out of the ICU, keep people out of off of ventilators and to save lives. And our number one destination was India. So, I mean, that's an example of what companies did. And I think it's another reason why this talk of things like IP waivers is really counterproductive.
Well, gentlemen, thank you for sharing some of your frustrations. Obviously, we've all got the message loud and clear, I think, about the IP waiver, but the positives, the innovation, the collaboration, the partnerships. Let's move forward and see how this pandemic is going to evolve over the next 12 months or 18 months. Albert, some people are talking about a vaccine glut at the moment. I mean, how do you see output of vaccines evolving this year and next?
Look, let me take it a step back, how I see the disease or the COVID evolving, because there's a lot of questions about that. And I'm not sure that anybody knows for sure, but the most likely scenario is that the virus will continue being with us for the years to come. This is a virus that it is endemic everywhere, so it's very difficult to eradicate. It's a virus that the immune protection after natural infection or vaccination doesn't last long. So people that are vaccinated, but more importantly, people that are getting the disease, they can get it again and again, even with the same variant. And this is a virus that creates different variants that are escaping the immune protection of the previous variants or the previous vaccine. So all of that makes it complicated. So we will be with the virus for long. This doesn't mean that we won't be able to take our lives back. I think pretty soon, a lot of the countries will start relaxing their social distancing measures to a very large degree because there is an overwhelming demand from people. Even if in some cases it is questionable scientifically, I think they will, because there is a big push to relax those measures. But those, together with variants, will increase again and again, the waves that we are going to see. The fact that we have, as I said, hundreds of millions of doses available for free for the poorest countries of the world that we cannot right now utilize, it's a problem, because that will create a constant pool where the variant will mutate. So all of that are concerns, but we can defeat it because right now we have vaccines and treatments that could help us, even with relaxing the social distancing measures, to be able to go back to normal life. The vaccines, I agree. The issue is that right now we are in many countries in the fourth dose, and that creates a fatigue to people. And I'm sure that the way that this will end up will be that those people that they haven't vaccinated so far, I don't think that the very big, large numbers of them, we will see them changing their mind and getting vaccinated, unfortunately. And from the people that they got vaccinated, which hopefully, thankfully, is the largest percentage, I think the compliance of the fourth dose will not be as high as with the third. That again means that we will have some reduction in the protection of the population. And this is where I think treatments play a key role, because we will be having waves that are coming, because of social distancing relaxation will coming more often, and because of immune resistant waiving of the immune responses, they will be more intense. So I think treatments is what really will take a serious role in the months to come. That being said, vaccines have a significant role to play, even more now that we have an Omicron than before. Everybody is working to see if we can get better vaccines. But for me and for Pfizer, what the world really needs, it is a vaccine that can last a year. I think this is what will become the optimal public health solution. Vaccines that will be taken a year is way more easy to be administered and have the population be compliant with them. And we are working on that. I don't say that it is easy to do. It's very challenging technically, very challenging technically to do it with this virus. But we are working on it.
Albert, I mean, looking to future pandemics, what do you think needs fixing? What do you think needs to be improved?
I think we need to learn from what worked very well and what didn't work that well. I think the thing that clearly stands out is that we were lucky because we had a thriving life sciences sector when the pandemic hit. Without that, we wouldn't have diagnostics, we wouldn't have the treatments that Lilly brought, we didn't have the vaccines that us and AstraZeneca and Moderna brought. It's not that any other organization brought them. It was the private life sciences sector that I think worked very well. So I think one of the most important things that society can do, it is try to maintain the strength of this private life sciences sector. So next time they will come to a solution to things that we don't know how they would look like. So that's number one. The second thing that worked very well was collaborations between industry partners that we discussed extensively about it, but there are a lot of examples that companies did way out of their current business model that helped the opposition, basically, the competition, but also through public and private sectors. And I will use the example of regulators. I think FDA, EMA, Canada, Israel, Japan, all of these regulators, they did a tremendous job. I remember that our scientists will be up 3 days and nights to compile a set of data that will go to FDA or EMA in the morning, early morning, 5 o'clock in the morning, so that when FDA opens the next day, a group of FDA scientists will take their round and they will stay sleepless 3 or 4 days to review the data. That was the level of collaboration that we had. And I think that helped a lot. What didn't help at all, and it was a very big issue, was the fact that there was politicization. It became a political statement if you do a vaccine or not, if you wear a mask or not, and that created tremendous damage to the global health. It became a very big issue, the protections that a lot of countries did, and David spoke about it. I want to say that ourselves, we were producing in the US and in Europe on purpose. We did that so that we will be able to diversify the production line. I have to say that Europeans did better job on that. I think by the end of May, June, we were not allowed to export at all from anything that we were manufacturing in the US. Europe, although they had restrictions on us as well, they allowed 50% of our production to go to other countries. So I think I need to commend the European leadership for doing that. But I think those are the things that we should be doing better, to not to have a mindset that Europe first, America first, let's protect everybody else before others getting it. That's one. Secondly, let's not use that for political for political gains. For example, this thing that let's waive IP, that's insane. And by the way, it has nothing to do with the availability. People are just getting the opportunity, knowing that there are hundreds of millions of doses that are available to be given for free, to say, no, we need to be able to waive the IP. This is not because they want to see vaccines in the hands of poor citizens of the poorest countries. If this is what they wanted to see, they would be helping with infrastructure in these countries to be able to take these vaccines and vaccinate. I think that they care it is to promote a narrative that they have.
Understood. Bill, let me bring you in something that we haven't talked about so far, which is testing. Testing, which you need obviously for timely treatments. Are there sufficient high quality tests available?
Yeah, I mean, testing is a fascinating topic because it's sort of like you have to start with thinking about where does it fit in the overall approach to COVID? Because if a test is indispensable, it allows you to know, hey, do you have an outbreak? But on the other hand, it doesn't solve it, right? So it's been something that's been debated on and off over the course of the pandemic in the role of testing. I think we're really proud that we were able to stand up high quality, very, very sensitive and selective tests very quickly. I mean, within weeks, we had our first lab test, and then we had a high volume test again within about 2 months of the start, which is amazing because normally these are things that take years to develop. I think now in the world there are literally billions of tests. The challenge is, getting to the high quality ones, because a poor quality test is actually worse than no test. Now we and other manufacturers have been able to bring, very high volumes of both PCR tests, which are sort of the gold standard and, 99% plus sensitivity, but also rapid antigen tests that have quite high sensitivity, especially for people that are giving off significant amounts of virus. And so, the question, do we have enough? I guess it sort of depends. I mean, there's not enough testing capacity that, say, everybody in the world is going to test every day. But I think there is enough to successfully manage outbreaks of a virulent strain. And I think there's been a lot of collaboration to get us there. But again, it shows the need to have a healthy life science ecosystem with intellectual property and also free flow of materials. And this has been mentioned a bit by Albert and Dave. I mean, there were times where we had some real white knuckled moments with governments where we needed to be able to export raw materials, intermediate goods and finished goods from country A to country B. And there were times where country A was saying, nope, you can't ship it. And we're saying, no, we got to ship it. And you don't want to go there because if you shut us down on export, then the raw materials that are coming from another country, they're not coming in. I think this turn towards nationalization of supply chains, I don't think it's really the answer. The answer is more around keeping those supply chains open. And, fortunately for the world, largely they stayed open. I mean, there were some very tense moments we had where we were worried, but we kind of managed to persuade the politicians, like, hey, don't do this. This is not going to go well. And so we've largely been able to keep the supply chains flowing over the whole course of things.
Bill, what would you say was your one lesson learned from the pandemic?
Let me give you two that are, and first off, I want to agree with the lessons you heard from Dave and Albert. I think those are right on. A couple things that weren't mentioned. I mean, I think one thing is that, no country was perfect in their response. There were highs and lows. I have to say, the one thing that the US and Japan did really well was procurement. I mean, they were signing up for things way in advance of them being ready or even being proven. Whereas I'd say Europe was a bit slow on that. And, it was amazing to us, for example, with Ronapreve, when we demonstrated, that, for example, in high-risk patients, that we could have an 80% reduction in need for hospitalization. And you think, wow, and this was when there were ICUs overflowing across the continent, that countries were, kind of haggling over how many doses, and taking kind of weeks and months to get it done. And that really surprised us that, whereas we have the US and Japan basically saying, hey, we want 1 million doses and we want them now, and we're ready to sign the contracts. And some of the European countries were much slower on that. I think another thing I would say that was frustrating at times was in the clinical trial side on treatments. So we were running studies, phase 3 studies, high quality, randomized controlled studies for vital treatments for hospitalized patients. And we found ourselves competing with literally tens of thousands of tiny studies that were never going to show anything. So when I say competing, so let's say we were in a hospital in America or Europe doing a study, and we needed, let's say, 50 patients in the study. And what we found is patients were coming in, and a lot of them were being diverted to kind of local favorite studies of investigators in those hospitals. They wanted to test this or that theory, but instead of putting patients into our phase 3 studies that were so much what the world needed answers. Does this, does Actemra work? Does Ronapreve work? And I think there were a few countries like the UK that really did well with that in terms of standing up national programs that they committed to, to really prioritize patients into the most important, most promising treatments, rather than the patients just getting dispersed into hundreds of small studies that were never going to show anything important.
Understood. We've got lots of journalist questions coming in. Dave, you were mentioning some of the things that could be done better earlier. Anything else that you would just like to add that you hope will be done better for our future response for the pandemic? And then I'll start directing some of the many journalist questions that are coming in as we speak.
I'll try to be brief. I mean, I think there's books, literally many, written about both the lack of resilience in the healthcare systems, especially in developed economies, as well as the public health agenda, and how we really could learn a lot in those two areas. But I think one thing that really did work was our ability to develop medicines and vaccines very rapidly that basically are the one reason we're talking about escaping the situation. And I think all we have to do is look at Hong Kong or what's happening in the tragic outbreak in China right now to realize the limitations of public health responses in the healthcare system to manage a pandemic. We need technology. So in that regard, I'd say a couple of things. I mentioned it earlier, but running, and Bill talked about this, clinical trials rapidly on a common global backbone and at the speed of the virus is critical. And we really lack a mechanism to define what that standard of care is. And I think we need a credible organization to do that. Perhaps it's leadership from key countries like in the G7 or something like this that could allow us to know what standard of care is. And I don't think the WHO is in a position to do that, sadly. But that's something essential for more rapid development of medicines and vaccines that we would like to see. Secondly, I'd say on the supply chain, a pandemic treaty seems like it's in order, especially between the major sources of materials for our industry and perhaps for other critical components in healthcare, so that we don't have this sort of freezing of borders in a way, or at least creating the uncertainty of that, which by itself will slow things down, that really did impact us. And if, when there's a pandemic declared, this kicked in automatically, I think it would give a lot more flexibility to the suppliers to meet the needs where the epidemic is happening. And then two other things which we adopted, I think Bill mentioned this as well, I'm sure Pfizer's doing this too, that I think are just really essential from the industry side, because we need to be part of the solution too. First is to commit to allocate product based on need and risk, and to go in with that assumption. That doesn't mean that those countries will procure accordingly, but that our commitment would be to supply medicines and vaccines where the need and the risk is greatest versus where the money is greatest. And I think that's a policy we adopted, others have too, and I think it would be good for the industry to adopt that and for the recipients to acknowledge that. Now, going with that will have to be a tiered pricing model, because we know the ability to pay is different by country. I think all the companies on this call adopted such a construct. But this allows us then to, and in our case, we had a price for Europe, Japan, US. We had a different price for middle income countries, which was 40% of that, so 60% off. And then we agreed at cost everywhere else. That may be different by company and technology, but I think this kind of thing then avoids all the discussion about domestic suppliers and the need for these IP waivers and so forth. It's really about make as much as we can, allocate it to where the need is, and have a fair price based on ability to pay. And I think those are principles as an industry we should adopt.
Thank you very, very much for those thoughts about going forward in the future. We've got lots of questions for Albert on vaccines, some of which he may have already addressed in his opening remarks. We'll try and take as many questions as possible. A first question to Albert and then to Thomas. It's from Le Monde in France. The vaccines against COVID marketed today protect against severe forms but do not prevent contamination. When will we see a vaccine that also prevents COVID infection? And the follow-on question, some countries have authorized a fourth jab, especially for the elderly. 4 jabs in the space of 16 months is a lot. Albert referred, I think, a little bit to this in his opening remarks about the fatigue. The question here is, can we expect to see soon vaccines that provide longer protection? So a vaccine that also prevents COVID infection and vaccines that provide longer protection. Albert.
First of all, let me clarify, the vaccines, they do prevent infections. Not only they prevent hospitalization. It's just that with Omicron, the protection against infection is lesser than it used to be with Delta, which after the third dose was reinstalled into the 90%. That was infection, not hospitalization. With Omicron, that went down, but still it is protecting against hospitalization to a very big extent. So hospitalization is way higher the protection. Now, I replied before, or I said before, but I realized that people will not comply with the 4th or 5th recommendation, if ever something like that comes. With the same degree that they complied with the 2nd. Way more people did the 2nd than they did the 3rd, and then way more people will do the 3rd than they did the 4th. This is why we need to come to scientific innovations that will allow us to have a vaccine that is annual. This is the ideal gold standard. It's not easy technically. It's very challenging scientifically to do something like that. And that has to do with a specific virus. It's not something that we cannot do in general with vaccines. There are vaccines that we can give and they can last for life. With this virus, after months, you have the ability to the virus to overcome the response of the immune system. So we are working on that, and hopefully we will have more news later. But it's not something that is coming in the next 1 or 2 months.
Thomas. Anything to add on that question?
Basically, I can only echo what Albert said. The vaccines have really worked marvelously, because in the first year we only had non-pharmaceutical interventions, public health, distancing, mask wearing, whatever. I have to admit, I feel myself lucky. I've been 3 times vaccinated so far. And although resuming life also in business terms, almost normal, I've dodged the virus so far. Therefore, I can only say these vaccines help you to protect against, symptomatic, not just severe. But the other element, which I think we have to realize, it's amazing in what time frame we got not one vaccine, but several vaccines. Normally it took, the fastest before COVID was 4 years against Ebola. Before that, it took 5 to 10 years. And here you had several vaccines literally within 12 months of the pandemic being declared. Having said that, of course, we all want to have, the vaccine which works for a year. We are used, at least some of us, to get our seasonal flu shot. We may see a combination of flu vaccination with COVID vaccination. I do believe that we may one day see a polyvalent vaccine, and I have to admit, I have a lot of faith in the scientists of many companies working on it. But we should not forget there were about 300 vaccine projects, and right now there are less than 10 approved. Therefore, it is still high risk, and we are extremely lucky that we are where we are.
Reuters has a question, Thomas. When are we going to be able to say that it's the end of the pandemic? Well, that must probably be the WHO that says it, but what are your thoughts? What criteria must be met in order for it to be said that it's the end of the pandemic?
I think it remains to be seen, as Albert has already indicated, we are beyond where this virus can be eradicated. On SARS initially, 20 years ago, companies were working on vaccines, and SARS simply disappeared. Therefore, that's why you never saw the vaccines coming to fruition. Here, I think we are beyond the time where you can eradicate SARS-CoV-2. We do have to live with it. We are living better, and I think one of the reasons is Omicron, much more infectious, but much less severe. And we may see the movement from pandemic to endemic, where we can, as we already do in many parts of the world, resume normal lives. But we better keep, ourselves cautious. We better make sure that we don't move, as I already see, from panic to neglect. And that's why it's important to have vaccines as well as treatments available and continued innovation.
Albert, a question from the Associated Press. How did you come to the decision to share COVID-19 antivirals with the medicines patent pool, but not your COVID-19 vaccine?
First of all, in COVID-19, we do not have ourselves IP. I'm in principle against this madness of waiving the IP, but the IP belongs to BioNTech and not to us, just to clarify. Now, the reasons why we did waive all the license or IP rights for the poorest countries of the world, actually 53% of the population for Paxlovid, is because Paxlovid can be manufactured by others easily. So it is something that it is any basic pharmaceutical manufacturing site that knows how to make pills can do it. And we saw that by having almost 250 companies raising their hands to the medicines patent pool so that they wanted to provide vaccine. And then the medicines pool themselves, they suggested eventually, I think 35 companies that they gave license through us. So that was the only reason. Over there made absolute sense. So if you want to manufacture for these countries, please go ahead and do it. I don't think that they will be able to manufacture pretty soon, though. Although it is very, very easy to do it, and they will do it in already existing facilities. That's why right now my concern it is, what do we do in the meantime for these countries? And this is why we signed an agreement with UNICEF to provide them at cost millions of doses that can go to countries that normally after the generic companies can take over and provide those doses. That was the reason.
Understood. Thomas, and if anybody else would like to come in on this question, which is from Politico, please do. You've mentioned that leaders are warned that they need to prepare developing countries for vaccine absorption, getting these vaccines into arms. What are the conversations industry has been having with leaders about this to improve vaccine absorption, Thomas?
I think we have seen progress, and COVAX, Gavi, UNICEF, and others have initiated steps. We would have, as Albert said, loved that this started 10 months ago, and it started a little bit late. The reasons are multifaceted. We have to realize when you have to walk 8 hours to the next clinic where you can get the vaccine, that is tough. When you are, not trusting, for example, your government, and we have seen this even in our countries, we have a strong anti-vax movement, it is tough. But the issue of having the healthcare workers putting the jabs in the arms, the issue of having the syringes ready. I think we can learn some lessons for future pandemic preparedness, but now we really need to focus on getting those jabs in the arms of people. And in my view, we need to focus on the vulnerable, which means the elderly, those with comorbidities, and there we should aim to get as close to 100% vaccination rate, because they are most exposed and have the highest mortality rates, as we have recently seen in Hong Kong.
A question here from the Financial Times for Albert. Perhaps, Dave, you would also like to share your thoughts. Question from the Financial Times is, you mentioned the danger posed by politicization of pandemic response. Can you comment on the current delays to the $10 billion COVID funding package in the US? Could this leave the US at the back of the queue for new variant-specific vaccines? Question to Albert. Dave, if you would like to come in on it, please do.
I'm very concerned about that. I'm very concerned, not only because this restricts public funding, but because that's the only channel we can use right now to administer our vaccines. Let's not forget that treatments are completely in emergency use authorization in the US, and vaccines, although they are full approval, as and Moderna, it's not for all ages, the full approval, right? Pediatric is EUA, and so also the fourth dose is in EUA. So the only channel that we can do is through government purchases. We can't go to the open market as we will go normally with our products. So that, in combination with the lack of funding, will create an artificial issue, because Americans are very much willing, and insurance companies are very much willing to provide both treatments and vaccines, because they are very cost effective. By doing that, they are reducing their cost of hospitalizations, which is tremendous in the US. But that's the only way that we can do it so far. So without this funding, we have a big problem.
Dave, do you share Albert's concerns about the funding?
I do. It's important that people know that in the US context, that every EUA requires government procurement, central government procurement. It's prohibited to sell to other payers. So it's a chicken egg problem that if the government is unable to buy, then there won't be any supply of, what is an ongoing, virus and pandemic. I would say, as well, it's unfortunate that this is being caught up in, I think the opposition's view is we need more accountability on the billions that were allocated. That may be true, but it's also true that these medicines are running out now. For instance, I mentioned our monoclonal antibody. It's the only one authorized right now against BA2, and it's in a fixed supply situation that's dwindling every day. So, lives are at stake, and I think they need to get on with it and at least pass the short-term version of this. Long-term, companies need a path to full authorization. That's true, but that takes time through the normal regulatory system.
Albert, a lot of questions coming in on the variants here from Politico Europe and also Il Sole 24 Ore Italy. Question about Omicron modified COVID-19 vaccines. Will we need them in the autumn? How far along are they? Will we have a multivariant vaccine by then?
It is a possibility that we have it by then. It's not certainty. We don't even know the exact, we all collecting data right now. And as far as I know, Moderna as well as us, we are working on Omicron or different enhanced vaccines that could cover not only Omicron, but also the old variant. So that's the challenge. It's easy to do something only against Omicron. What scientifically and technically is more challenging, we must do, it is to be effective against everything known so far. So you don't have to do different vaccines for different variants, right? So I hope clearly by autumn, that could be, without being a certainty, that we could have a vaccine if we have one that works.
Another question on a timeline, which is, of course, when will Pfizer apply to the European Medicines Agency for a vaccine adapted to variants?
Again, once we have data that will allow us to make a decision as to which one is the best path forward. Because in our studies right now, we are testing different vaccines. We are testing bivalent and monovalent. We are testing different doses. So there are a lot of things that we are checking right now. So once we know what is the best path forward, when these studies read out, then we will submit to FDA, to European authorities, as well to every other authority in the world.
Understood. Thank you. Thomas, a question from Geneva Health Files here. What does the industry think of equitable access provisions in contracts with, say, CEPI or Gavi as a model for future health emergencies?
We have heard from Dave and Albert and Bill what companies have already done in terms of access provisions, of pushing, providing their treatments or vaccines for people in least developed countries. What we are seeing now also is there is a debate which is important. How can we improve equitable access in real time to those who need them most? I think realistically, we will continue to see national or regional procurement. I do not expect you will have a single global procurement agency, which also would need really mind-boggling money for that. But I'm optimistic that we will see more equitable delivery of vaccines or treatments in the future, not necessarily linked to access provisions in Gavi. CEPI is not procuring vaccines. CEPI is funding RD&M. But I do expect that we will see movement because the industry is willing to do that. Because as Dave said, need-based allocation. Because as we heard, by and large, the whole of the industry has committed to tiered pricing. What we learned also now is that export bans, such as April 1, nothing came out of India, and some vaccines not coming to the patients, to the people who waited for them, led to disruptions, so that COVAX now got more than 80% of their vaccines from 4 innovative companies, which at the beginning were not planned in, because the plan was a large extent from India, significant extent from a vaccine which is not there yet, and it's thanks to Pfizer, BioNTech, AstraZeneca, Moderna, and J&J that this could be compensated. I'm not sure that you could feature this into a pandemic treaty, because the reality is that the US president does swear an oath to protect US citizens first, but I do believe that we can do much better than we did now, and I'm actually pretty convinced that this will happen.
Thank you. Albert, a question from Reuters here on your antiviral. Take-up of Paxlovid has been limited by the extensive list of contraindications it carries. Are you worried that high-risk patients who could benefit from the drug will not be able to?
I do not think that is restricted by that. And whenever the countries are leaving it to the physicians to prescribe it, the scripts are going very high. Right now, in a lot of European countries, they have very onerous conditions, not in terms of if there is any drug interaction, because that's very, very easily managed by any primary care physician. It is only 5 days treatment. You can stop the other medicines in most of the cases, and that's it. But there are some onerous requirements as to who can receive it, and they are giving it to very specialized centers. I am aware that in most European countries, starting this week, they are opening it now to primary care physicians. Whenever a country has it already to primary care physicians, for example, if a doctor will prescribe, the utilization is very, very high. But right now we have some countries, some of them very big countries, that they have dispensed a very small percentage of the quantities that they already have.
Thank you very much. Bill, a question for you, and Albert, and perhaps Dave would also like to come in from APM France. What will be the consequences on vaccines and treatment prices when the pandemic period will be considered as over? Bill, what will that mean for prices of vaccines and treatments?
Yeah, I'd say from our perspective, I don't think there's an impact. If on April 30th, someone says, oh, the pandemic is over, that's not going to change prices. I think what we see in testing, for example, the prices have been basically coming down over time as there's been more competition. We decided to go in with very low prices at the beginning because we just said, hey, this is a pandemic and we want to make sure that there's broad access and this just shouldn't be an issue. But some of the manufacturers that had started with higher prices, those prices have now been driven down by competition, which is exactly how it should work. And I think, as Dave mentioned, and we adopted a tiered pricing approach to make medicines available at very, very low costs to countries, low and middle income countries, and basically that every country, that their costs would be based on their ability to afford the medicines and to ensure broad access. And that's not going to go away because the pandemic's over. I don't know if Albert, you want to talk about vaccines and pricing.
Yes,
I don't have anything to add to that. I really don't have anything to add to what you just said.
Dave, anything from your side?
No, I think Bill said it well. The only thing I'd point out is I'm not aware of a single health technology assessment related to the industry or independent from it that any of the approved therapies or vaccines were not worth the current price. I don't think there's been one publication in that regard. So I think the value produced has been verified by many outside groups. There are competitive forces that will likely drive down net pricing in most of these categories over time. So I don't think it's really been a important topic, to be honest. The bigger topic is how do we get the drugs to the patients who aren't getting them today? How do we get the vaccines there? And that's been well covered today.
Understood. Thank you very much, everybody. And as far as I can see, that is all of the questions that have come in from the journalists to our CEOs. Thank you very, very much, CEOs, for answering them so comprehensively. And let me give the final word to Thomas as we wrap up this briefing.
Thank you very much, Claire. And I think it's relatively easy to wrap up. While we are still in this pandemic, I think we need to talk lessons learned and what can we do better in future pandemic. But I think the first lesson learned, and we have heard it from Albert, Dave and Bill, is make sure that what worked well this time is not compromised in a pandemic treaty or in a future pandemic construct. And what worked well is really the innovation ecosystem, which is based on IP. What also worked well is, I recall when we had our first media briefing in March 2020, there was a strong commitment of partnerships, be it for manufacturing or development. And I personally believe that what worked so well during this pandemic will have an impact way beyond the pandemic. Now, what we haven't mentioned yet, because it's simply taken for granted, but it is potentially questioned, it was crucially important to have immediate access to the pathogen and the genetic sequence data. And few people realized that on January 11, the genetic sequence code of SARS-CoV-2 was put on a data bank which is open source, basically a collaboration of scientists, which had been put together for influenza surveillance called GISAID. And this GISAID, they extrapolated their genetic sequences capacities more than 1,000-fold. Actually, last year, within a week in December, they sequenced more codes than they'd done in the years before. And that is absolutely vital, critical, and I hear many discussions where this immediate unhindered access could be compromised. The other elements which I've also heard from the CEOs is it is important that there is a fund available. We talked about the need for fund in the US, but when I look at the needs for future pandemic preparedness linked to equity, we need to make sure that there is a fund available pre-pandemic, and an organization such as COVAX 2.0 doesn't have to wait for 4 or 5 months before they can start competing with the US, EU, or Japan. That's why I was really pleased over the last few weeks. I attended the CEPI Replenishment Summit. I attended last Friday the Gavi AMC Summit. Both of them were really successful. But we need something for advanced procurement for the developing countries early on, in addition to companies actually, as we heard, making commitments about need-based allocation, about tiered pricing for them. And last but not least, I think we just heard again the importance of open borders, of no trade restrictions. A year ago, we co-hosted the Chatham House Summit on supply chain and manufacturing. And I must say, when I look at the results of it, in terms of raw materials, intermediaries, and so, the situation did improve, and WTO actually have done a good job in calling out those trade restrictions. And I couldn't agree more with Dave Ricks when he said we sort of need to be built into a pandemic treaty a clear, strong, binding commitment to keeping borders open in the future.
Thank you very, very much, Thomas. And indeed, I'm sure you'll be following very closely work on that treaty, which is happening here in Geneva. So thank you very, very much to our CEOs for joining us. Thank you to Thomas Cueni, Director General of the IFPMA, and of course to the journalists for your questions. And you will find the recording of this briefing on the ifpma.org website. So please stay safe, stay well. Thank you very much for attending this briefing.